Okay, good morning. In this presentation, we are going to be analyzing some multiple choice questions that cover the topic of action potentials. The purpose of this presentation is that you see how to answer questions that relate to this topic and that you understand how the application of some of the core principles, big ideas of physiology help answering any question that covers this topic. We are going to start with the first question, and I want you to see the similarities between this question and the rest of the questions, and how understanding well the process of generation of the action potential and the process of maintaining the resting membrane potential in a neuron. Those basic concepts help answer these questions and any other question about the same topic. Our first question says, which number on the diagram presented best represents the phase of the action potential characterized by a rapid influx of sodium ions into the neuron? Okay, to answer this question, it's important to have clear how action potentials are generated. Okay, before we understand that, it's important to understand how the resting membrane potential is generated. Okay, in this diagram, okay, we have a starting point, okay, that is a little bit above the minus 70, okay, and is more or less in the 65 or something. Okay, then we have a number 1, that is that point. We have a number 2 that represents this line that moves towards 0 and to the positive values. Then we have a number 3, that is this peak here. Then we have the number 4, that is this descending line towards the negative values again, until we reach the lowest part here. So which of these numbers best represents the phase of the action potential where there is a rapid influx of sodium? You can take some seconds to answer. You can pause the video. Okay, and the correct answer here is the number 2. Okay, which is this line that moves from the negative towards the positive values. Okay, that is the phase where we have a rapid influx of sodium. What happens during this phase of the action potential? Well, remember that during the resting membrane potential, okay, the sodium channels are closed, the potassium channels are also closed, and we have just some leak channels for sodium and potassium. Okay, so there is some sodium that goes from the extracellular compartment to the intracellular compartment using these leak channels. And there is some potassium that moves out the cell using also the potassium leak channels. But these ions are going to be taken, okay, to their original compartments by the sodium-potassium pump. Means every sodium that enters the cells and every potassium that leaves the cells will be taken to their original compartments by the sodium-potassium pump that is constantly moving potassium into the cell and sodium out of the cells using ATP. But during the first part of the action potential, the depolarization phase, okay, the sodium channels open, some special sodium channels that are called voltage-gated sodium channels. They will open and there is going to be a rush of sodium into the cell. Sodium is a positive ion, so the inner part of the cell becomes positive because of this entry of sodium into the cells. At this point, the potassium channels are still closed. Okay, so no potassium will leave the cell. So we are only going to have a very rapid, okay, depolarization of the cell because of this rapid influx of sodium. That same concept will be applied to answer the rest of the questions. Okay, the other options are not correct. Okay, with the number 1 here, we have the resting membrane potential, not the depolarization. Here the neuron is at rest. It's not transmitting any signal. As we said before, only the leak channels for sodium and potassium are open, and the sodium-potassium pump is maintaining this resting membrane potential as a straight line. Okay, with the number 3, we have the peak of the action potential. Okay, this is not the phase where there is a rapid influx of sodium. Okay, on the contrary, at this point, as we are going to see in other questions, something happens with the sodium channels. Okay, and then we have the number 4, which is the repolarization phase. Okay, here the inner membrane is becoming more negative, so that can be explained by a rapid influx of sodium. When we have a rapid influx of cations, the inner membrane will become more positive, not more negative. And with the number 5, we have the hyperpolarization phase that is related to what we call the refractory period of the neurons, okay, because we need a very strong stimulus, okay, to reach what we call the threshold and trigger an action potential. This phase is slightly more negative than the resting membrane potential. So this is not correct. Okay, let's now move to the next question. Well, in this question, we have the same diagram, and the question says, or asks, which number in the diagram best represents the repolarization phase of the neuronal action potential? Okay, we already saw that the number 2, okay, represents the depolarization phase. So that is not the correct answer. We already saw that this number 1 represents the resting membrane potential. We mentioned that number 3, the peak, is a special point that we are going to cover later. So, and we also mentioned, okay, that number 5 is the hyperpolarization. Once you have these concepts clear, where we see the resting membrane potential, depolarization, peak, hyperpolarization, there is only one option that is possible, and that is number 4. Okay, this is the depolarization phase. It's the moment when the membrane potential is moving from the positive values towards the negative values. Okay, this question could be asked in another way. For example, in a similar way to the question that we saw before, that we were asking which phase or which number best represents where, or the phase of the action potential where there is a rapid influx of sodium. We could ask here which number best represents the phase of the action potential where there is an efflux of potassium. Okay, potassium is also a cation, it's a positive ion. So if potassium moves out of the cells, the inner part of the cell is going to become more negative. And that is what is happening here. The efflux of potassium moving from the intracellular to the extracellular compartment, makes the inner part of the membrane more negative. So going back to the concepts, the resting membrane potential is maintained by the sodium-potassium pump that takes the potassium into the cell and moves sodium out of the cells. Okay, that sodium and that potassium is the one that was leaking through the sodium and potassium leak channels. Here we have a rapid influx of sodium, the depolarization. And in the number 4, the repolarization, we have an efflux of potassium. That's why the membrane potential becomes more negative or travels towards the more negative values. Now we are going to see a question that contains similar concepts. So you can see that the same concepts can be asked over and over, just making some variations in the questions. Which of the following events or phenomena will most likely trigger a rapid depolarization of the neuronal action potential or of the neuronal membrane? Okay, we already saw that is this phase here, the number 2, rapid depolarization. And as we saw in the question number 1, this phase, the number 2, the depolarization, is triggered by the opening of sodium channels. Okay, and that is the correct answer there. Okay, this could be made a little bit more complex. For example, writing voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, so we can make this question in a little bit more complex level, mentioning that these are voltage-gated instead of ligand-gated or mechanically gated, okay, which would be present in the dendrites of the neurons, in the receptor area of the neuron, not in the axon, which is where the action potential occurs. So going to the other question, other options, for example, if we open potassium channels, as we saw before, what will happen is the repolarization, not the depolarization. If we close potassium channels, okay, or if we inactivate potassium channels, which would be a similar concept, okay, that would decrease the efflux of potassium ions, but that wouldn't, okay, produce a rapid depolarization, okay, of the membrane. Okay, if we close the potassium channels, what we are gonna have is that the membrane is gonna go back to the resting state. Here in this phase, we have the potassium channels open up to this point, and this positive value, the regeneration of the resting membrane potential, occurs when the potassium channels close. If we close or inactivate sodium channels, sodium won't be entering into the cells, so the cell is not going to become positive, so it's not going to depolarize. That's why these two options, E and F, are not correct. Okay, so we have another question very similar, but instead of asking for the depolarization, it's asking for repolarization. Okay, and we already saw that concept. So after seeing the previous questions and the explanations and the rationales for those, I think this becomes very easy. Okay, and what happens in the repolarization, remember, is this phase here, number 4, moving from positive to negative. Okay, so we need to have some positive charges moving out of the cells, so the inner membrane becomes more negative, and that is only possible if we open potassium channels. Okay, if we close them, positive charges won't be leaving the cells, so the inner cell doesn't become negative. If we inactivate them, it's the same. If we open sodium channels, the inner membrane is going to become more positive, not negative. If we close or inactivate sodium channels, well, the inner membrane is not going to become more positive, but this phenomenon wouldn't explain this rapid movement towards the negative value. That only happens if we open the potassium channels. Okay, so that's not going to have the same effect, the same rapid effect. Simply the inner membrane doesn't become more positive, but that doesn't make the membrane become more negative. Now here we have another question. Simply we have to choose the number, okay, which number corresponds to the moment when voltage-gated sodium channels are inactivated. And this may seem a little bit more complex, but if you study the generation of the action potential and if you study how this graph is generated by the movement of ions into the cell and outside of the cell, and because of the opening and closure of different type of channels, okay, this question is not gonna be very hard. Okay, as we explained, this is the resting membrane potential. Number 2 is the depolarization. Number 4 is the repolarization. 5 is the hyperpolarization. So we only have one of these numbers that hasn't been mentioned. And that is the number 3, which is the correct answer for this question. Okay, how do we explain this? Remember that for the rapid depolarization, we have the opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels. These voltage-gated channels respond to changes in voltage, as their name says. They will open at some point here that we are gonna mention in a later question. And these voltage-gated sodium channels at this point are going to be inactivated. Okay, that means they can't be used anymore until the membrane potential goes back to the resting membrane potential. So when the membrane potential reaches a positive value, the sodium channels are inactivated, and that's why we have this peak. At this point, at the same time that the sodium channels get inactivated, we have the opening of the voltage-gated potassium channels, leading to the repolarization and hyperpolarization phases. Now, we can ask the same concepts instead of using the graph, instead of using plain questions as the ones we have seen up to this point. We can represent or assess the concept using some little real-life scenarios. For example, mentioning that a researcher is experimenting to understand the process of action potentials in neurons. Okay, the researcher applies a stimulus and the neuron fires an action potential. The voltmeter, okay, is measuring the voltage inside the cells, indicates that immediately after applying the stimulus, the neuron's interior rapidly becomes more positive relative to the exterior. Okay, so there you can see a representation of the same thing that we saw in the previous graphics. Okay, the membrane potential moves from negative to positive. That is the depolarization. So which of the following options best explains this phenomenon? I'm going to give you some seconds. You can pause the video. And well, the options are sodium channels open and sodium ions rush into the neuron, potassium channels open and potassium ions rush out of the neuron's resting potential is re-established after a brief hyperpolarization, voltage-gated sodium channels are inactivated, and potassium channels are about to open, and the neuron is at rest, at its resting potential with no ion exchange. Okay, so using the previous explanations and recognizing that this movement of the membrane potential from negative to positive is the depolarization, you will know that the correct answer is A. Opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels and sodium positive ions moving into the neuron, making the inner part of the membrane more positive compared to the exterior. And a similar concept can be asked using this other vignette. A neurobiologist is experimenting on neurons to observe the generation of action potentials. Using an electrical stimulus, she gradually increases the intensity of the stimulus. She notes that no action potential is triggered until a certain stimulus intensity level. However, an action potential is consistently generated when the stimulus exceeds this level. What conclusion can be drawn from this observation? I'm going to give you some seconds. You can pause the video here. And well, we have different options. The stimulus has reached hyperpolarization. The stimulus has reached threshold. The stimulus leads to the opening of potassium channels. Stimulus has reached repolarization. And the stimulus makes the inner side of the membrane more negative. Okay, and this question is assessing the understanding of a concept that is very important to understand the action potentials phenomena as an all or none phenomenon. Okay, neurons are receiving stimuli from different other neurons, sometimes thousands of neurons. Some of these stimuli are excitatory, are depolarizing. Some of these stimuli are inhibitory or hyperpolarizing. Okay, the excitatory stimuli will open sodium channels, leading to a small depolarization. Okay, inhibitory stimuli are the ones that open potassium channels, okay, leading to the inner membrane becoming more negative. So these are hyperpolarizing. Okay, the neurons have a section, have a part that is called the axon hillock, okay, which is making the summation of all of those stimuli, okay, the excitatory and the inhibitory stimuli from thousands of other neurons. And only if the sum of those stimuli reaches certain level, okay, the axon will trigger an action potential. That's why we call it an all or none phenomenon. And that voltage at which the axon generates an action potential is called the threshold. And that is the concept that is assessed here. Okay, if the stimulus produces hyperpolarization, it becomes more negative. Okay, if we open potassium channels, potassium will leave the cells. Positive charges will leave the cells. So the inner membrane is going to become more negative, will become hyperpolarized. If the stimulus reaches repolarization, well, that doesn't makes too much sense. If we repolarize, we are going back to the negative. We're traveling towards the resting membrane potential. And if the stimulus makes the inner side of the membrane more negative, it's exactly the same thing, hyperpolarization, or what would happen if we open potassium channels, or what would happen if we repolarize the cell. So there is only one possible option here. Okay, the purpose of this presentation is that you see how the core concepts of physiology, the understanding of these big ideas, okay, allows you to answer any type of question about the same topic, doesn't matter how it is presented.